All right, now that we've seen the end of the war, let's talk about what happened to Japan after the war, because that's a little bit more, that's an interesting topic that I feel like a lot of people don't know about. So, post war Japan, we had decided that, especially moving into this Cold War era, that we were going to have to rebuild Japan. We're going to take over, and the U.S. occupation of Japan is going to change their culture along with the dropping of the nuclear bombs. So, again, a little bit of background. Japan had been really aggressive. They had decided that they were going to, intervene and be this imperial power and take over all of their neighbors. They became this incredibly strong power, but we were going to need to check them, right? We beat them in the war, and now we need to return them or modernize them so they don't have to be this imperialist power. So Douglas MacArthur, again, the same person that was leading the military campaigns, is going to take over this occupation. The first problem was feeding the citizens, because if you've destroyed all of these, you've destroyed their means of getting resources, you're going to have to make up for it, right? You want them to not be an imperial power. Well, that means that you need to get them the resources that they were taking over other countries for. Now, a lot of people didn't want to give them aid, but essentially what Douglas MacArthur said is, or thought was, if you don't feed these people, if you don't get their economy restarted, they will go back to their way. They'll take up arms and they'll fight again, right? They'll become that imperial Japan like they were before. And he's also going to institute a free press because he wants them to modernize and westernize is kind of the typical sense or the typical term that we say. So I have this question here. When you make a new democratic country, what are some of the things you need to have? You need a free press. You need a democratic government. You need to have a constitution, right? He's going to realize that if you want to westernize, if you want to, I hate to use this term, quote, civilize in the same way that European countries have, you need to follow the same routine. You need to have a constitution. You need to have a set government. You need to give people rights, like women the right to vote. Now, we are going to have a trial for the military personnel that put on some of these wartime atrocities. If you guys remember Nanking, you also have the Comfort Woman of Korea. You have a bunch of these POWs that are tortured and killed. So we're going to set up this international tribunal, the International Tribunal of the Far East, right? That was the term that we used for this. This was meant to punish many of the high-ranking officers for the war crimes or the crimes against humanity. That's how we would typically refer to them. This indicted 28 Japanese military and civilian leaders. So one of them would be Hideko Tojo, right? He's going to be the head of the military. Now, one of the problems that we'll see here, and I will kind of skim over this, essentially is that we needed to keep a lot of the leadership without, we need to keep a lot of the political leadership and get rid of some of the old bad seeds without collapsing the government, without collapsing the military. So we indict people like Tojo. We indict people like some of the heads of the military, but we leave the emperor, the person who was organizing and telling the military leaders who to attack and what to do and what was okay, right? Giving these people that leniency to do whatever they wanted, right? So Hirohito is not going to be held accountable. He's not going to be put on trial because the Americans figured that we needed him as a figurehead in this transition into modernization. So even though Hirohito was at the forefront, was really organizing some of these war crimes, he had to stay. So when you talk about international law, this is 100% a failure at international law. This is not holding the heads of countries accountable for the war crimes that they committed or were committed in under their country's name, right? So we're going to use Hirohito to promote democracy. He's no longer going to be this actual emperor. He's just going to be kind of in the same sense of like Great Britain, where the queen is, she's the Queen of England, but she has no real power. That's essentially what they're hoping Hirohito will turn into, that he will be the representation of the greatness of old Japan, right? That's why the people are going to adopt this kind of Western idea. Now, the long-term plan is for the Americans to basically stay in Japan, rebuild the economy and the military to make them a modern state. Right, we're hoping to stay in as long as we have to. We're going to have the Japanese Self-Defense Force, which we're going to actually use during the Cold War moving forward. We're going to use UN peacekeepers to kind of help keep the country organized and safe. And the U.S. is also incredibly interested in keeping Japan afloat because of the sudden rise in communism across Europe. The Soviet Union is going to be expanding their reach, which is going to be very scary for the free democratic West. Now, there's going to be a lot of cultural crossover and some of the things that you may not realize that come about from World War II. Right, they're going to start appreciating and kind of adopting or appropriating American culture. You have them creating their own Mount Rushmore so that they can see American presidents, right? Their own Statue of Liberty. You're also going to see the adoption of bikinis and swimsuits or baseball. If you talk to any baseball fan, right, Japan has this huge this huge influence in the international baseball scene because they adopted it very early on in the 50s, right? Just like, a lot of other countries. But because the Americans had such an influence, some of these cultural norms just crossed over very quickly. You have people that are going to adopt rock music. There's a Japanese Elvis impersonator, right? All of these aspects of culture is going to cross over. The adoption of blue jeans. That's kind of the running joke, is that any culture that's influenced by the Americans immediately takes on blue jeans. And that's what they did. You have the kind of music and dance trends coming about in Japan. You have this kind of romanticization of the rebel without a cause, the James Deans, that kind of mischievous, hardened kind of dream boy, or whatever you want to say. Like the same cultural icons that the United States has are also being adopted in Japan. And one of the other things that I like to kind of throw in here as a kind of consequence of the war, you're going to have two cultural developments in Japan. You're going to have kind of the great monster idea, right? If you think about like Godzilla comes out of Japan, this idea that this monster comes about and destroys the city, and the government's not able to do anything. That's kind of a callback to this the wartime of World War II. This monster, this United States coming in and destroying their city with the Tokyo bombings and things like that. These are all ways of coping with the devastation that Japan had, right? Creating something relatable, right? So Godzilla is this manifestation from the devastating bombings. You have like the kawaii culture, right? This anime culture where people are creating these very overly cutesy things to compensate for the horrifying devastation that they see outside. The dropping of the atomic bombs and the seeing of the effects of that are going to influence and encourage people to think of things that are overly cutesy, overly positive, to try to compensate for the world that they see around them. The world without food, the world with devastation, the people without homes that are deformed from the nuclear explosion. It's this escapism that's going to tie into their culture moving forward in Japan.